Boo! Hello, my name is Wendy Weather, the History Drag Queen, and welcome to Spooky History Season 5. Those who are new to the YouTube channel and or to me, Wendy Weather, I used to do short form content pretty regularly for the past like 4-ish years. And my staple series that I've always done every October was called Spooky History, and it still is. I started doing Spooky History like way back, like in 2020. Like, she's been here a moment. And as I was planning on making this transition to longer form videos via YouTube or other outlets, I very much wanted to be like, okay, Spooky History has to be like the very first like series that I do long form. And here we go. And this is Spooky History Season 5. If you guys have missed Seasons 1 through 4, I actually have a TikTok compilation posted on my channel for you to enjoy and watch. So I do recommend to go ahead and pop on over and watch that before you start watching Spooky History Season 5. In the past, Season 1 was about the origins of Halloween. Season 2 was the history of scary places. Season 3 was the history of monsters and creatures. And Season 4 was all about the occult and mystical. And Season 5 is all about the history of horror. This season, I'm going to be discussing, dissecting, and explaining the history of horror in all of its facets. And today, we're discussing the history of horror and horror itself and its origins. So what is a horror story? So a horror story or a scary tale is actually a story that is supposed to emit the feeling of fear. And horror actually makes up a substantial work of folklore literature. And those stories can actually encapsulate a plethora of different things. They can talk about witches, vampires, monsters, anything supernatural like ghosts, demons. And there is even psychological horror. So where does the idea or conception of horror take place? What was the original horror story, or what was the original scary story? Well, not surprising to me, during my research, I found out that it obviously was the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is pretty much the grandfather of anything that revolves around storytelling, conceptualizing ideas, and things like that. Specifically, I think it was tablets 6 and 12 of the Epic of Gilgamesh actually deal with like witches, a haunted bull, and somebody like raising the dead. So very supernatural, ooky, spooky things up in the Gilgamesh. So the origins of horror and or scary stories go all the way back from pretty much storytelling itself to even Greek antiquity. And as we all know today, horror pretty much has reinvented itself several times over the centuries. And the story intends to have an atmosphere of scariness, eeriness, or something to frighten the reader or listener. And as I've mentioned before, horror has very deep folklore roots, all the way to the Epic of Gilgamesh. And early horror stories actually revolve mostly around death, afterlife, evil, demonic things, and the principles of society. And they were used in folklore stories and religious traditions that were passed down mostly orally. And horror as a Western or European type of genre of storytelling was pretty much solidified by the Greeks and the Romans. If you are not a peruser of Roman mythology or Greek mythology or even Greek stories, there is a very decent handful that are just kind of scary and crazy and whew. But nowadays, horror can actually be pretty much subjected into about 50 genres or subgenres. In this origin era of horror, there are a couple of different examples. For example, the Odyssey is technically considered a subgenre of horror because the way Homer writes and depicts things, the hero does, venture into the afterlife, and there's also the summoning of like ghosts and spirits and other things like that. Technically, that's like a supernatural horror. So, like, that's part of that's scary. Like, Another one, the Old Testament, the Bible. Yeah. Some people would say the Bible is kind of a horror scary story anyway. But, in the Old Testament, I think there was like, I remember being in Sunday school and stuff, there was like a story of like a witch, and she like summoned a prophet of somebody. Like, there's like spookiness in the Bible. Like, there's, whew. And then there is also, what was it called? It's like Mostellaria or Motellaria. It's a play, a Roman play by a Roman playwright. I think his name was Plautus or Plautus. And it is pretty much the first story of like a haunted house or like a haunted dwelling. And then there was, I think it was like The Witch of Berkeley. And then that leads us into kind of medieval horror literature. And oddly, the French during that time liked werewolf stories or like weird monster transformation stories like that. Don't know what was going on over there, but okay. And not only during the medieval Dark Ages, horror actually became less and less, and just stories in general, because after the fall of the Roman Empire, literacy rates tanked to the floor, plummeted. And societies became pretty much too fragmented to publish books and like have people have books. And so literacy rates just kind of were to the wayside, and the only people that were really reserved to like knowing how to read were usually clergy, and they were too busy copying religious texts. They had no time to come up with ye olden medieval horror stories and things. Except the only thing that is the exception in the entirety of that is the Divine Comedy by Dante. After that, horror really doesn't really get into its stride until the Gothic era. This era mostly started in the late 18th century, which is the 1700s, just to remind you, and the 19th century, which is the 1800s. And of course, this is like the classic horror like era, like the icons were here. Pretty much, Gothic horror is described as like dark, brooding, the aesthetics of, Gothic things and like just dark fantasy stuff. And of course the classics come out of this, where we have Bram Stoker's Dracula, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and like the creation of like body horror. The next era is probably going to be in the 1900s, and we kind of stumble upon this like golden era of horror and like scary storytelling, because that is when the infusion of new technology happens, and we get radio and we get movies. I mean, come on. War of the Worlds? Like, come on. People freaked out. When people started hearing War of the Worlds on the radio, they legit freaked out. They were like, wait, is this real? Is this real? What? Huh? And an explosion of horror stories went into the silent films, and then later on into the talkies in the 20s. And most of those were recreating those old Gothic scary story tales. Most of that is actually like the infusion of new technology with these older stories, and like them making Bram Stoker's Dracula into a movie, and like having other horror stories played over the radio and things like that. It wasn't until later that we start getting into like a psycho thriller type of story now, which is kind of more of like the modern tales of horror stories and like scary stories, where there's like psycho thrillers that like from Truman Capote, like in Cold Blood and things like that. And then there is the modern era of horror where we have 80s slashers and like 90s supernatural movies. Like it, you know, if you've been alive for the last like 20-ish years, you pretty much know how like scary movies have went. And that's where we get modern classics like Friday the 13th, Scream, with the infusion of movies being kind of overtaking the literature format of horror. Now, that doesn't mean people are, you know, not writing scary books still. I mean, there's still scary books being written. I think, what is his last name? Hendricks? Great, like, dark fantasy horror storyteller. Love, 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 love. And so the last era just kind of brings us to today. And you're probably thinking, yeah, horror stories and scary things today are, you know, kind of like in movies, TV, yada, yada. Well, just like in the early 1900s with the explosion of new media being created like radio and movies, new technologies have actually even thrust horror into a new realm. And that, my dear lovelies, is video games. Horror and video games have pretty much been besties since its inception. Some of the most highest grossing video games are horror adjacent and or related. I mean, take a look at Resident Evil. Probably one of the like highest grossing like IP franchises that even came about from video games. And even more modern games like the Dark Pictures Anthology and other horror games. I mean, even Alice Madness Returns. Like, classic, like, modern video games, most of them are, like, horror adjacent. Or have some type of, like, genre of horror infused into them. Like, I mean, just a couple weeks ago, girl, I played The Quarry. Like, the idea of horror is pretty much disseminated in every single type of aspect of, like, human storytelling or creative nature. And that, my dear lovelies, is pretty much a quick overview of the history of horror and its existence. Thank you guys for watching the first episode of Spooky History Season 5. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And put in the comments, do you have a favorite horror story or favorite type of scary story? Put in the comments, I want to know. Me personally, I like slasher films and slasher books. Like that, like, people running away, trying to overpower somebody who's trying to, like, kibosh people. Like, I don't know. I just feel like that story is just kind of, it's very climactic, very, like, on the edge of your seat. Like, ooh, what's gonna happen? Like, that's the reason I like those. But my best friend, she loves spooky, demon evil, crazy things. That's her zhuzh. Me, I'm not. I cannot watch a supernatural horror movie. I can't do it. No ma'am. And remember to stick around because you might learn something.